Welcome to part 2 of the videos covering chapter 8 of my book on iOS7 development for absolute beginners. In part 1 you saw how to use a built-in picker for dates and times, and in this video we'll cover using a custom picker for whatever type of data you like. So let's get started by creating a new Xcode project. This project will be a single view application. We'll call it Custom Picker Test. Leave the organization name and company identifier to be whatever you like, but ensure that class prefix is empty and devices is set for iPhone. And then press next. You'll then be asked where you want to put it. On the desktop is fine. Just make sure that the source control checkbox is unchecked and click create. The project is created for you, and by now you should be familiar with the contents of the project. You've got your app delegate, your view controller, and your main storyboard. So we're going to edit the main storyboard next. And to do a custom picker, you use something called a picker view. Now you'll find the picker view on the controls palette down here. You can scroll around and try to find it, or you can just go and type in picker and it'll show up. So it's this guy right here, and if I had typed picker, we'd see the date picker that we used in the earlier video of the picker view. So let's drag and drop the picker view now onto the design surface. So if I do picker view and I drag and drop it, you'll see again the guidelines giving you a rough outline for what it would look like. So I'm going to drop it like that. Now this data that's on it, just towns in California, is just as a sample to show you what your view would look like at runtime, and if you want to resize it, you can. This video doesn't actually render, this data doesn't render at runtime. We're going to have to create our own custom data. But let's place it there, and that looks pretty good as it is. And then in addition to that, let's just put a UI label control. And I'm going to drag and drop it somewhere below the picker, and I'm going to set the width of the UI label to be the full width of the iPhone screen, less the margins. Okay, so now we have everything that we need in our UI, and we just need to create outlets for this guy, for the UIPicker, and an outlet for the label. Now, typically when creating applications, and as we've been doing it so far, we usually generate some actions and we're thinking, okay, we're going to select something on the picker and that should generate an action that we're going to program against. But in this case, actually we don't. In this case, the delegate, if you remember from earlier videos, by delegating functionality of the picker to the view, then events will also be delegated. I'll show that in a moment. So I'm going to just open the assistant and I'm going to drag using the control key from the picker to my header file, so viewcontroller.h. I'm going to control drag. I'm going to generate an outlet, and I'm going to call it team picker, like so. And then I'm just going to drag from my label and create an outlet that I'm going to call LBL output. So now I'm just going to close the assistant and go back to straightforward code editing, and I'm going to edit viewcontroller.h. Now in order to use custom data in a UI picker, your app needs to be able to handle delegated functionality from the control, and in addition to this, it has to be a data source for the control. To do this, we use the same syntax, if you may remember from using delegated functionality. Now in this case, the view controller is a delegate for the picker view, so we say picker view delegate. But in addition to that, it's also a data source for the picker view. So we're going to say UI picker view data source. So we can comma separate these attributes for the UI view controller for stuff that it's going to be able to do. So by the fact that we've said it's a UI picker view delegate, then functionality from the picker view, such as actions on the picker view, can be delegated to the view controller to handle, so we don't need to create actions for them. And in addition to that, because it's the UI picker view data source, now on the view controller we have to specify the data source for the control itself. So instead of those towns from California, we'd be able to put our own data into it. So we can do this now by editing the code for the view controller. So if I open view controller, it's going to look something like this. Now we see a little warning here on the view controller, and that's because we've set it up to be a delegate. And as a delegate, it needs some methods to be implemented, and I haven't implemented those methods yet, but we're going to go ahead and implement them in a moment, so that warning should go away. So the first thing I'm going to do is say my picker is going to, the data in my picker is going to be of the best soccer teams in the English Premier League. So I'm going to put them into what's called an NS array, and I'll just put the team names in there. So I'll say it's NS array team names. And I'm putting this on the view level rather than within any of the functions, because it's going to be used within multiple functions. So how am I then going to create this array and create this data? I will do this within the view didLoad, and within here I can create an array using syntax like this. Team names equals, and I'm going to go 2 square brackets, ns array alloc, because I need to allocate the memory for the array before I do anything. And then I'm going to initialize the array with a list of objects. I'm going to say init with objects, and my objects are just simply going to be strings with the names of the teams. So I'll say something like Liverpool, and this will be comma separated, Manchester United, Manchester City, Cardiff City. Oops, I forgot to put an @ in front of that. Remember, in Objective-C, you should always lead your strings with an @. I'll do a couple more. Arsenal, Chelsea. You may form a habit like I'm doing where I just type the strings and then have to go back and put the ats in. And Spurs, something like that. I'll put my ats in front of these. And then when you create a list like this, you should always end it with nil. So it knows where the end of the array should be. And then a single square bracket and a semicolon. So now I've created this data, and so as an array, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 actual team names. And then in addition to that, within view didLoad, if you remember, we have the picker, and we created the picker and we called it team picker, but we have to specify that the team picker's delegate is the view and its data source is the view. So I'll say team picker dot delegate equals self. Now remember, the self keyword is referring to the view, not to the subject of the sentence, which would be team picker. That's something that I often used to fall down on when I got started. And then the data source is also the self. So now we've specified that the view controller is a UIPicker view delegate and a UIPicker view data source. And then within here we say we want it to be the delegate for team picker and the data source for team picker. Okay, so next there are a number of methods that we need to implement because we're now a delegate. And the first of these is, it's called the number of components in the picker view. If you look at your picker view, you can have multiple columns. If you remember the date and time picker view, you'd had columns for month, a column for year, a column for day, that kind of thing. Those columns are called components, and it's an integer value or an ns integer value that defines them. So if I start typing minus ns integer like this, and then I hit the number n, the letter n, the auto detect is saying, hey, look, you probably want to write number of components in picker view, and you don't want to type that whole thing out. So I've typed n, it picks it for me, and I press tab, and I get the whole function created for me, or the function signature created for me. I put in my curly braces, and we can see here that it's going to return an integer. So my picker only has a single column. You know, it's my team names, so I'm just going to say return 1. So now when iOS is trying to draw the picker control, it's going to take a look at the delegate for the picker control, and the delegate says, oh, this function in the delegate says, here's the number of columns you need to do. I'm saying there's only one column, so we're good to go. So next are the number of rows in the picker. So that's the number of items that we're going to be able to pick from. Now, in this case, of course, we have 7 teams, right? So we should say return 7, or we could be a little bit smarter about it and say we could return the list of the array of data of the team. So then if that changes, the picker itself would change. So what we do is, again, we start typing ns integer because it's going to return an integer. And I'm going to hit P for picker view. And so you can see here the picker view function number of rows and components is the default one that's created for me. So I'm just going to press tab, and the signature is created, and just putting in my curly braces, and I want to return the length of my array, and in this case I say team names count in square brackets like that. So now as iOS is creating the picker, it knows there's one row, and it knows the number, it knows there's one column, and it knows the number of rows is based on the length of my team names. Alright, so now the complicated part is how do we set up, how do we tell it which name goes in which row for that column. And again, it's a delegate function. So the delegate function is called title for row. And so if I again start typing ns, and it's going to be an ns string that goes in each one, and I pointed to an ns string. I'm going to do that and type p for picker view. And now we see picker view has a title for each row and for each component if we have multiple components or multiple columns. I'm just going to press tab again so that this whole thing gets filled out instead of me typing it. And we see that a string is going to be returned, which is a title for a particular row called row on a particular column called component. Now we only have one column, so we don't need to check multiple columns here. We just need to check multiple rows and return a string out of that. So what I'm going to say here is return team names object at index row. So let's look at that. So when iOS is drawing the picker control, it now knows that it needs to draw 7 rows because we've told it it's the number of team names. So it's going to call this function 7 times. It's going to call it once where row is equal to 0, once where row equals 1, once where row equals 2, etc., etc., because we said 7 times here. It would call it then actually 7 times 1 times. If we had more than one component here, say we had 10 components, 10 columns, and we said for each component there were 7 rows, then that would be 70 total cells. So this function will get called 70 times. So look at it this way: as this number multiplied by this number is what gets returned. Or within this function, we say, for row 1 we might return 3, for row 2 we might return 5, for column 1 we might return 3, for column 2 we might return 5, etc. So the total number of cells will be calculated, and then this function will be called that number of times to fill in each individual cell. But because we only have one component, as determined here, this function is just going to get called this number of times, which in this case is 7. So we're going to return the object in our array corresponding to the row. So when row is 0, our object 0 is Liverpool, so we'll return Liverpool. When row is 1, our object 1 is Manchester United, so we'll return Manchester United, etc. So that's how we set up the data. So the next thing we want to do is handle the delegated events. So the delegated events, the main one is that when a user selects a row, we want to be able to do something. So I'm going to come back down here, and the function is a void, and it's called did select row. So once I start typing void and then p for picker view, it doesn't understand it yet, so I'm going to say I for picker view, and it goes so right now you're probably trying to select a row. Sorry, because it was cut off by the video, I'm just going to do that again so you can see the whole thing. So now called by the picker view, and the user selects a row in a component, is this picker view did select row, and it tells us what row and it tells us which component. So that looks perfect to me. We only have one component, so we can ignore it. And now all I have to do is say lbl output dot text equals team names object at index row. So I'm just going to write to the label the string corresponding to the row that we've selected, and that should be the actual team name at that row. Let's take a look at this and see if it actually works. So I run it. And now we can see our picker, and I can move it. I guess I placed it badly, so the label doesn't exactly work. Whoops. So the label is overwritten by part of it. But as I move my picker around, once I've settled onto a team, we can actually see that the string gets loaded into that team, and my custom picker is actually working. So in the next step, let's take a look at expanding this then to a multi-column picker so that we could have something functionality a little bit like the dates one that we saw earlier. So first, before I do that, I'm just going to move my label down a little bit. You see there were 5 items of data here, so the picker was sized according to 5 of them, but I had 7 items, so it was thrown off a little. So I'm just going to move that down and then go back to my viewcontroller.m. So if we're using a multi-component picker, the first thing we need is a data source for that component. So we have team names in one component or column. So I'm going to put a team predictions in another column. Predictions. And that's also an array. And I'll set up the array in the same way. Team predictions equals ns array alloc init with objects. And I'm going to put a number of strings in here. I'll just fill out the empty strings first because it makes it a little easier later. And I'll just do 4 of them. And put a semicolon there. So some of the stuff that I was explaining earlier about how the data setup will be a little bit clearer, I think, when we see it with multiple columns. Will be champions. Oops. Will qualify for Europe. If you're a soccer fan, you'll probably understand some of these concepts. Will win the FA Cup. Or will be relegated. Okay, so those are now my team predictions. They've been set up for me. Now, we're going to have 2 components this time in my picker view instead of 1. So there's 1 component for the names and there's 1 component for the predictions. So here I'm just going to say return 2. Now, the number of rows in the component obviously is going to change now based on the component, because one of them is going to have 7 and one of them is going to have 4. So in here, I have to get a little bit more detailed. I'll say something like int number of rows. And here now I'll say switch component. I'll explain all this in a moment. For component 0, number of rows equals the count of team names. And for component 1, the number of rows is the count of team predictions. Like so. And then instead of returning team names count, I'm going to return number of rows. So when we set up the picker view to have 2 components this time, iOS, when it's drawing the picker view, will take a look at this, say I have 2 components. So then it's going to call the number of rows in component function twice. It's going to call it by passing component equals 0 for the first component, and it's going to call it by passing component equals 1 for the second component. So in here I'm going to say, okay, depending on the component value that you call me with, if you call me with 0, I'm going to tell you the number of rows is the count of team names. If you call me with 1, the number of rows is the count of team predictions. So there's going to be 7 team names and 4 team predictions. So now let's look at updating our titles per row. We have to do something quite similar. So now this function is effectively going to be called 28 times. It's going to be called with component equals 0 for the number of rows in that component, which was 7, and it's going to be called with component equals 1 for the number of rows in that component, which is 4. So here I'm going to come in and say, I'm going to remove this and say, okay, I'm going to return a string called title. And then I'm going to switch the component value. When the component is 0, I'm going to set the title to be the team names object at index for the row. Break. And when the component is 1, I'm going to set the title to be team predictions object at index row. And break. And then I'm going to return title. So again, when component equals 0, it knows that there are 7 rows. So it's going to call it with component 0, row 0. Then it's going to call it with component 0, row 1. Then component 0, row 2, etc. until it's exhausted all the rows for component 0. In this case, it's 7. Then it's going to set component to 1. It's going to call it with component 1, row 0. Component 1, row 1, etc. until the number of rows are filled out. And as a result, because we have 7 by 4, this function would be called 28 times. So when component equals 0 and row equals something, we'll return the team names object at index for that row, and ditto for the predictions. And as a result, now it should be set up. Now catching the selection, of course, is a little bit different. So we only have one label output on here, so I'm just setting that label one output to be the team names object at index. We should also maybe add another label for the predictions. So I'm just going to go back to main storyboard. I'm going to open the design view. I'm going to add another label below this one. I'll make it full width. I need to create an outlet for it. So this is my second label. Control drag over here. I'm just going to call it LBL output 2. And now go back to my code. Close the assistant. So now in my picker view, I'm going to do a very similar thing, because in my did select row, because this also accepts a component and a row parameter. So I was ignoring the component before because I only had one, but I can't ignore it now. So I have to say switch component. So I'm going to say here now, case 0, then we know it's the team names one, right? So we can just reuse this line of code here. The LBL output text equals that. So I'm going to cut that, paste it. Let me just realign it, and then break. And then if it's case 1, I've now selected the predictions column. I'll say LBL output 2 dot text equals team predictions object at index row, and break. And then I am done. So let's take a look at how this is going to look. So if I run the app again, so here it is, and now I can see I have my picker with my teams, I have my picker with my predictions, and unfortunately, because the width of the iPhone doesn't handle all the text for this, you can see it's being truncated, but that's something you can tweak and work with. But as I change my rollers for each of these, my pickers for each of these, we can see, that the different predictions will happen. So, if I, for example, say Cardiff City, and then I can say will qualify for Europe, something along those lines, and we see the data gets updated. So here's a great example and a very simple example of using a picker and creating a custom picker for yourself with your own data source and with multiple columns. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.